Your soulmate is the biggest liar you have ever known. They are telling everyone they are struggling because you are. Something about the way they said your name made the entire room go quiet. It happened during an ordinary conversation, the kind nobody expects to remember. A few people were gathered around, talking casually, when someone asked your soulmate a simple question about how life had been lately. Their expression shifted. Their eyes dropped for half a second. Then came the answer. I've been struggling because of them. And suddenly, you became the explanation for everything. The distance. The sleepless thoughts. The strange mood nobody could understand. But there was one enormous problem with the story they were telling everyone. They weren't telling the whole truth. Not even close. Because while they made it sound as though you had complicated their life, they carefully left out what happened whenever they were alone. Stay close to this moment, because the difference between their public story and their private reality is where everything begins. Behind closed doors, they weren't trying to forget you. They were replaying you. A conversation from weeks ago. A look you gave them when neither of you knew what to say. A moment when you walked away and they almost called you back. Your soulmate had become incredibly skilled at pretending those memories meant nothing, yet their smallest habits kept betraying them. They would hear a song and suddenly become quiet. They would see something funny and instinctively think about sending it to you. They would open an old conversation, stare at the screen, and close it again without typing a word. And still, when someone asked what was happening, they chose the easiest explanation: you were the reason they were struggling. But listen carefully, the struggle wasn't coming from what you had done. It was coming from what they refused to admit about themselves. They had feelings stronger than their pride knew how to handle, and instead of explaining that complicated truth, they created a simpler story for everyone else. Then someone finally noticed the contradiction. It was a person who had been listening quietly from across the room, watching your soulmate's expression every time your name surfaced. They didn't argue. They didn't embarrass anyone. They simply asked one question. If this person makes your life so difficult, why do you smile every time you talk about them? Silence. Complete silence. Your soulmate looked away, but it was already too late. That tiny reaction exposed more than a long confession ever could. Because their face had changed before they could control it. There had been warmth there. A softness. Almost a secret happiness hiding beneath all those dramatic explanations. And now everyone in that room was beginning to understand something your soulmate desperately wanted to keep hidden. Maybe they weren't struggling because you were impossible to love. Maybe they were struggling because admitting how deeply they cared would force them to become vulnerable. But that question was only the beginning. Later, after everyone had gone home and the room had become still, your soulmate sat alone with words they could no longer escape. For the first time, they began wondering how many people now believed a version of you that wasn't fair. Their confidence disappeared. The excuses stopped working. And then they reached for their phone. Your name was right there. One tap away. Their thumb hovered above the screen as if one message could undo weeks of pretending. They typed a sentence. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Then, finally, they wrote something completely different, something they had never told anyone. And before they could decide whether to send it, another message appeared on their screen. It was from the person who had asked that uncomfortable question earlier. And the message contained one line that made your soulmate sit perfectly still. The message didn't accuse them of anything. That was what made it impossible to ignore. It simply read, "You know that isn't the real reason you're struggling." Your soulmate stared at those words while the glow from the phone lit their face in the dark room. For several seconds, they didn't move. Then they opened the unfinished message they had been writing to you and read it again. This time, the words looked different. Too careful. Too polished. Another attempt to hide behind explanations instead of saying what mattered. They erased everything except one sentence: "I haven't been honest about you." Their finger hovered over send. But before touching the screen, they stood, walked toward the window, and looked outside as though the quiet street might somehow give them an answer. What they didn't realize was that the biggest lie wasn't simply what they had been telling everyone about you. It was what they had been telling themselves. Because you were never the reason their world felt complicated. You were the person who made them question the comfortable version of life they had accepted. Around you, pretending became harder. Their feelings became clearer. The future suddenly looked different from the one they had imagined, and that frightened their pride more than they wanted anyone to know. So whenever friends asked why they seemed distracted, they blamed the connection. Whenever someone noticed them checking their phone, they said things between you were complicated. Whenever your name brought that unmistakable expression across their face, they quickly covered it with another story. Yet now someone had seen straight through the performance. And here's the detail that changes the entire picture: that person knew something about your soulmate's private conversations, something that proved they had been speaking about you very differently when they thought nobody important would ever hear it. The next morning, your soulmate met that person at a quiet coffee shop. Morning light stretched across the table. Cups clinked behind the counter. People moved around them, unaware that one carefully protected truth was about to surface. Your soulmate tried to act casual, but the other person didn't waste time. "You keep telling people you're struggling because of them," they said softly. "But 3 nights ago, you told me something completely different." Your soulmate froze. They remembered that conversation immediately. It had happened late at night, when their defenses were down and honesty had slipped through. They had admitted that you weren't creating the struggle at all. The struggle came from missing you while pretending they didn't. From wanting to repair things while worrying they had waited too long. From realizing that every excuse had pushed them farther away from the one conversation they actually needed to have. Stay with this, because their response at that table revealed why the truth had been hidden for so long. Your soulmate finally whispered, "I didn't know how to admit that." And for once, there was no performance in their voice. No clever explanation. Just someone realizing that protecting their pride had accidentally created a story in which you carried blame that never belonged to you. They looked down at the phone resting beside their coffee and understood exactly what had to happen next. Not another vague message. Not another carefully edited sentence. A real conversation. If stories like this make you think about someone meaningful in your own life, you're welcome to share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for the next chapter. Because this story was about to turn in a direction even your soulmate hadn't expected. They picked up their phone, opened your conversation, and began typing again. But halfway through the message, the person across the table leaned forward and said, "Before you send that, there's something else you need to know about what everyone has been saying." Your soulmate slowly lowered the phone. Because apparently, their lie had traveled much further than they realized. What your soulmate heard next erased the last trace of confidence from their expression. Not because the truth was frightening, but because their careless story had quietly grown into something they never intended. The person across the table leaned closer and explained that people had started filling in the missing pieces themselves. One friend believed you had stopped caring. Another assumed you were impossible to understand. Someone else had apparently repeated that your soulmate was trying their best, while you kept making everything complicated. Your soulmate's eyes widened. "I never said that," they replied immediately. And technically, they were right. They had never used those exact words. But by repeatedly saying they were struggling because of you, then refusing to explain what that actually meant, they had created an empty space, and everyone else had filled it with assumptions. That realization landed heavily. Their story had escaped their control. Worse, it had transformed you into a character you never agreed to become. Keep watching this carefully, because the next decision revealed whether your soulmate wanted to protect their image, or finally protect the truth. They picked up their phone, but they didn't message you yet. Instead, they opened the group conversation where some of those misunderstandings had begun. Their fingers moved slowly across the screen. "I need to correct something I've been saying." They stopped. "Read it twice." Then continued. They explained that when they said they were struggling because of you, they had made it sound unfairly negative. The truth was far more personal. They were struggling because they cared more than they had admitted. Because distance had forced them to confront feelings they kept pushing aside. Because every time they tried to convince themselves they could simply move forward without addressing what existed between you, something inside them resisted. And then came the sentence nobody expected. "They didn't create this confusion. I did." Your soulmate stared at those words before sending them. 1 second passed. Then 2. Finally, they pressed the button. No dramatic speech followed. Just silence, a cooling cup of coffee, and the strange relief of someone who had finally stopped maintaining a lie. Responses began appearing almost immediately. One person wrote, "That makes much more sense." Another admitted they had completely misunderstood the situation. Then someone asked the question your soulmate had been avoiding from the beginning, "So why haven't you told them?" Your soulmate leaned back and closed their eyes briefly. There it was. The question beneath every other question. Why tell friends? Why create explanations? Why spend weeks discussing your connection with everyone except the person actually involved? The answer wasn't complicated anymore. They were afraid of hearing something they couldn't control. They could control the story they told friends. They could control when they opened old messages. They could control whether they admitted missing you. But they could never control your response. And that uncertainty had kept them hiding behind the biggest lie of all, the idea that you were somehow responsible for their emotional struggle. Now that lie was gone, and there was nowhere left to hide. Your soulmate finally opened your conversation again. This time, they didn't compose some perfect paragraph designed to make themselves look innocent. They wrote plainly, "I've been telling people I'm struggling because of you, and that wasn't fair. The truth is, I've been struggling with myself because I haven't been honest about how much this connection means to me." They stopped there. Their heartbeats seemed visible in the slight movement of their hand. But before sending it, they remembered something. One conversation with you that they had interpreted completely wrong. A sentence you had spoken casually, months earlier, which they had quietly used as justification for keeping their distance. Now, sitting beneath the soft morning light, they suddenly understood what you might actually have meant. And if their new interpretation was correct, then this entire separation had been built around a misunderstanding neither of you had ever cleared up. Their eyes returned to your unfinished message. And this time, they added one question that could change everything between you. The question looked almost too simple for something that had taken them months to ask. When you said you needed space, were you asking me to leave your life? Or were you asking me to understand what you were going through? Your soulmate read it again, and suddenly that old memory returned with startling clarity. The quiet place where the conversation happened. The hesitation in your voice. The way you had looked at them as though there were more words waiting behind the ones you actually said. Back then, they had heard rejection. They had walked away believing you wanted distance from them personally. But now another possibility was unfolding. Maybe you had needed patience, not disappearance. Maybe you had wanted understanding, not an ending. And instead of asking, your soulmate had created an answer inside their own mind, lived according to it, and eventually told everyone that you were the reason they were struggling. There's a detail here that matters more than it first appears. Sometimes the biggest misunderstanding isn't created by what someone says. It's created by the question nobody has the courage to ask afterward. They finally pressed send. The message disappeared onto the screen, and for the first time there was nothing left for them to edit, soften, or hide. Your soulmate placed the phone face down beside the coffee cup, but barely 10 seconds passed before they picked it up again. Nothing. They tried to continue the conversation across the table, yet their attention kept drifting toward that silent screen. A minute passed. Then another. And something unexpected happened. Instead of becoming impatient, they became reflective. They began remembering every time they had described you as complicated, when what they really meant was unforgettable. Every time they said you made things difficult when the real difficulty was pretending they didn't care. Every time someone had asked whether they wanted to move on and they had answered too quickly. Those lies hadn't made their feelings disappear. They had only delayed the truth. If this unfolding story reminds you of how easily two people can misunderstand each other, you can share it with someone who might connect with it. Leave your perspective in the comments, and subscribe if you'd like to stay for more stories like this. Because just as your soulmate seemed ready to accept that your response might take time, the phone finally moved against the table. Your name appeared on the screen. They stared at it for a second before opening your message. And your answer wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was one sentence: "I wondered when you were finally going to ask me that." Your soulmate's expression completely changed. Their shoulders relaxed, but their eyes remained fixed on those words. Then another message arrived. You explained that when you asked for space, you had been overwhelmed by everything happening around you and needed time to understand your own emotions. You hadn't asked them to disappear. You hadn't wanted them to tell themselves that the connection meant nothing. Most importantly, you never knew they had interpreted your words as a final rejection because they never came back and asked. Your soulmate covered their mouth with one hand, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. Months of confusion. Endless conversations with other people. All those carefully constructed explanations. And the truth had been sitting behind one unanswered question the entire time. But your final message changed the atmosphere again. You wrote, "There's something else you should know. Someone already told me what you've been saying about me." Your soulmate's smile vanished, not from fear, but from immediate embarrassment. They looked across the table, suddenly understanding why this conversation had been pushed toward honesty today. You already knew. Perhaps not everything, but enough. And now they couldn't approach you pretending this was simply about reconnecting. They needed accountability. They needed to tell you exactly why they had turned their own confusion into a story about you. Their fingers returned to the keyboard, but before they could type, another message arrived from you. "I wasn't upset that you were struggling. I was surprised by the reason you gave everyone, because you once told me the exact opposite when we were alone." Your soulmate stopped moving. They remembered that private conversation too. And the words they had spoken to you that night proved, beyond any doubt, that they had known the truth all along. The memory returned with uncomfortable precision. Your soulmate could almost hear their own voice from that night, the night when there had been no audience, no friends waiting for an explanation, and no reason to protect their image. You had asked them directly, "Why does this feel so difficult for you?" And after a long silence, they had answered with the truth. "Because I care about you more than I expected, and I don't know what to do with that." That was it. The sentence they had somehow buried beneath months of completely different explanations. Sitting in the coffee shop now, they realized something almost unbelievable. They hadn't discovered the truth this morning. They had known it from the beginning. Everything afterward had been an attempt to make that truth easier to carry. Calling you complicated was easier than admitting vulnerability. Saying you were the reason they struggled was easier than explaining that losing the connection mattered more than they wanted anyone to know. But now you remembered the original confession too, and suddenly their entire public story had nowhere left to stand. Their fingers moved across the screen again. This time, there were no deleted drafts. "You're right," they wrote. "I knew what the real reason was. I just didn't have the courage to keep saying it." Then they added something even more important, "And I'm sorry I allowed people to misunderstand you because I was protecting myself." They sent it before doubt could interfere. Your response didn't arrive immediately, and strangely, your soulmate didn't panic. Something had shifted. They were beginning to understand that honesty wasn't a clever sentence designed to guarantee the response they wanted. Honesty meant telling the truth even when the outcome remained uncertain. So they waited. Around them, the coffee shop continued its ordinary rhythm, chairs moving, quiet conversations, sunlight slowly crossing the floor. Yet inside that ordinary morning, something extraordinary had changed. Your soulmate had finally stopped trying to control how everyone saw them. And that mattered, because the next message from you wasn't about their feelings at all. It was about what they planned to do with the people who had heard the lie. You asked, "Are you going to correct it with everyone, or only with me?" Your soulmate read the question twice. There was no cruelty in it. Just clarity. And they knew exactly why it mattered. An apology made privately couldn't fully repair a misunderstanding created publicly. So they began reaching out, not with dramatic announcements, but with simple corrections. To one friend, "I gave you the wrong impression about them." To another, "Please don't blame them for what I was going through." And when someone responded, "Then what was really happening?" your soulmate finally answered without hiding, "I cared deeply, misunderstood something they said, and instead of